Welcome to everybody. My name is Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. My job is very simple, just to call the room to order, welcome you. Please do read, watch, listen to American Purpose. My colleague, Michelle High, will put American Purpose, a link, and if I may say, opportunity to support our work in chat. Do have a look, do consider it. Thank you. My introduction, my welcome to Neal Stephenson, Frank Fukuyama, co-founder of American Purpose, chair of our editorial board, and my friend and colleague, Susie Garment, our senior editor, who's going to scene set, properly introduce, and start us off and tell us what we have in store. But welcome to everybody. Neal, Frank, and Susie, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. This is a room that is filled with, I would say, fans of Frank Fukuyama and fans of Neal Stephenson. There can be no better an audience. I must say that this current book of Neal's is a little bit different from his previous ones. I never anticipated that I would spend the first 100 pages of it chasing after feral pigs or hogs or boar or whatever the hell they're called on the way to a story of near oblivion. But that is how these novels always go. Frank, let me just turn it over to you and get you started.
Okay, thanks very much, Susie, and welcome, Neal. It's actually great pleasure to see you again. I remember very vividly when you came to speak to one of our little groups at SAIS in the late 1990s and talked about visiting your relatives in Boone, Iowa, and taking a piece of dental floss that was a little bit too long for the local norms. But I really want to begin by doing a little bit of background. I want to get to Termination Shock. I think it's a terrific book.
Thank you.
You know, it's a very long one, and I actually picked it up and I read it in like 5 days because I think it was really just a page turner, and so very much recommend it. But before we get to that, I want to just make sure that everybody understands the role that you've played in shaping the way that we, and especially younger Americans, think about the future. So I think that after The Big U and Zodiac, your first really big book was Snow Crash. I actually reread the whole novel a couple of years ago because it had been a while, and you know, it's really a foundational book in many respects. The way I would situate you is as follows: that the big nightmares of the early 20th century were all nightmares about over-centralization and tyranny. So that's like 1984 and Brave New World. But your book was a kind of revelation because the nightmare, the dystopia, was exactly the opposite. It was one of disintegration, right? Where the United States falls apart into burbclaves and you need passports and visas to go from one suburban subdivision to another. The federal government is reduced to just the territory on which federal buildings are sitting. The CIA and the aircraft carrier enterprise have all been privatized. And so it was very much, you know, the kind of opposite problem from the one that we had imagined would hit us, you know, in the early 20th century. So just to start out, oh, and another important thing is that you are the inventor of the metaverse. So the metaverse was the online world in which you could enter as a 3D avatar. The hero of the book was a man named Hero Protagonist, who you know, was a very good swordsman in the metaverse and could behead people and so forth. And now Facebook has renamed itself Meta, and it claims that it's going to transition into a, you know, its own metaverse. So I guess what I'd like to begin by asking you is, do you think that that fear of disintegration is still the biggest worry that we have as a society, especially here in the United States? And is that kind of the central political reality that we have to think about going into the future? And then maybe you could say a little bit about the metaverse itself, because I'm really curious about what your relationship to Facebook is, given that they're kind of appropriating that entire concept.
Zero.
So they've just stolen it.
They're using it. But going back to the first part of your question, let me perhaps sort of take a longitudinal view very quickly of the topic that you're referring to of decentralization. What you're seeing in Snow Crash is me kind of reacting to what I was seeing in tech and kind of nerd culture around the late 80s, early 90s, which tended to be about libertarianism and an idea that the future needed to be more decentralized and government was bad and needed to be made smaller. And so that's where we get all of the elements of Snow Crash that you referred to, the burb claves as kind of basically independent extraterritorial states and the reduction of the federal government to a very small rump. And so I think that had some momentum through the 1990s, but with 9/11, things kind of boomeranged back the other way, because the way people respond to events like 9/11 is to want more, to sort of be willing to grant more authority to the centralized state in order to combat the perceived external threat. So I think that the trend kind of went back the other way during the let's say the first decade of the century, and in those days I tended to look back almost kind of nostalgically on the world as depicted in Snow Crash, because it seemed a little bit quaint, or as though it had been sort of overtaken by events in a certain way. What we've been seeing since then, kind of in the second decade of the century, it seems to me we're going back in the direction of decentralization and disintegration, but in a different way than what's talked about in Snow Crash. Snow Crash is kind of the classic libertarian, capital L libertarian view of how society could and should be organized, and what we've got now is instead more of a systematic assault on the foundations of a democratic and rational society, which is more and more clearly the result of concerted tactics being directed against us by bad actors using social media as kind of a crowbar to split things apart. So that's kind of my capsule history of the whole topic of centralization versus decentralization, and we can get back to that as much as you would care to, but just quickly about the metaverse, which is the second part of your question. People have been working on these kinds of multiplayer, multi-user environments since before Snow Crash was written. There was an application called Habitat that existed before Snow Crash that actually used the term avatar. So it's been a preoccupation of people in tech for a while, and it's just always has been a question of how much engineering do we need to throw at it to make it real? And what's available to us in the way of networking capabilities and graphics hardware to make these things work as well as possible. So for a while, we've had massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft that work pretty darn well to get a lot of players together in one virtual space. Fortnite more recently does it very well. They tend to do it by having multiple shards. So the Fortnite, each shard of Fortnite has 100 players in it at a time. That's to reduce the complexity of the networking problem, but those numbers are going to go up over time and as the engineering problems are solved. So there's nothing new about working towards metaverse type applications. What we're seeing just within the last few weeks with Facebook and other companies is kind of an adoption of that as a business strategy for the next few years. As I tried to make clear in a tweet after the Facebook Meta announcement, I have zero relationship with Facebook and haven't even communicated with them on this topic ever. So I have no idea what they're doing, but I think there's a certain element of smoke and mirrors in that announcement, given that they're not actually making a metaverse product at the moment outside of some research labs. And what their actual product that they're actually making money from right now is very different applications like Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and so on. I don't know, that's kind of a quick pass, maybe not quick enough over your questions, and I'm going to shut up for a bit. And
I should just tell you before we get to Termination Shock that your penultimate novel, Fall, had an idea that I've expanded in a Stanford working group. You had this idea, so the first part of that novel was set 17 years in the future, and people had these editors, which was basically there to take out all the crap on the internet, and that if you were a richer person, you could afford a higher quality editor. Whereas ordinary people, could believe that there was a nuclear explosion in Moab, Utah, simply because somebody had made that up and it passed, for truth on the internet, which strikes me as an extremely relevant problem today. But we had this idea that we called middleware, where you do exactly that. And actually, what we're trying to do now is explore the business model that would have to support something like this, but hopefully this is an idea that will come into play. All right, so let's go on to Termination Shock. I actually posted a small review of it because I had read it in conjunction over the summer with Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, both of these being novels about global warming. And I must say, your book is much, much better. I mean, Ministry for the Future, although President Obama said that it was one of his favorite books, reads like a kind of diatribe. It's not even literature in many places. It's just a sermon about global warming and the evils of neoliberalism and so forth. And I think that the novelistic qualities of Termination Shock are really quite remarkable, and they raise some really big geopolitical issues. But maybe you could just talk about the book a little bit and your intentions, and just to introduce everybody to it.
sure. I mean, first to Ministry for the Future, I do recommend it. Particularly the opening scene is a depiction of a type of climate disaster called a wet bulb disaster, which is a situation where the heat and the humidity both get so high as to preclude the survival of unprotected human beings. So typically for Kim Stanley Robinson, it's a well-researched and harrowing kind of sequence. And that's by way of saying that what I'm looking at when I'm trying to address in termination shock is just a very basic set of realities that that all have to do ultimately with the amount of carbon dioxide that we have put into the atmosphere over the last couple of hundred years. So prior to I'm probably telling people stuff they know, so I'll try to be brief with this, but prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was 250-ish parts per million. When I was born, it was about 320, and today it's 411. No, it's 414. It was 411 a year ago. So that's how fast it's going up. It is, it's inevitable and the number has not been that high for millions of years. It's still going up every day, and the rate at which it's going up is increasing. So what people talk about at conferences like the Glasgow conference last week is trying to reduce the amount of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere every year. But that doesn't reduce the amount. It just reduces the rate at which we're putting more in. And the moment when that number flattens out and we stop increasing the CO2 level of the atmosphere is still several decades in the future, even among the most optimistic projections. So even if all of that happens, if say in 2060 or 2070, we become a zero carbon emissions sort of economy, the number is still going to be pegged at 500 or something parts per million until we use carbon capture to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So we are going to see some really bad things happening, these wet bulb disasters, the rise of sea levels, the acidification of our oceans, and all of the other sort of things that we normally associate with unpleasant climate change predictions. The idea of solar geoengineering has been around for a while. We know that because nature has performed this experiment for us many times during human history that when a volcano ejects sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, it forms a sort of veil that bounces back some of the sun's radiation and reduces the effects of global warming. And we know furthermore that it all goes away in a couple of years. So it takes about 2-ish years for this veil of sulfur dioxide to kind of wash back out and for things to return to normal. So solar geoengineering just means, what if we deliberately did that by building tanker planes that could go fly up very high and spray this stuff directly, or guns that would shoot it up there, or balloons. The delivery mechanism doesn't really matter. It's all well within our technological capabilities, and it's not even particularly expensive. So the scenario that's described in Termination Shock is that a billionaire in Texas who's derived his fortune from roots in the oil and mineral extraction industries simply decides to take unilateral action and builds the world's biggest gun in West Texas and begins to shoot shells full of molten sulfur into the stratosphere. Sulfur is burned to produce SO2, and so he's essentially doing this on his own. That is all kind of a fait accompli at the beginning of the book. And so what the book is really about is how do people react to his doing this. Where it gets really interesting is that if you do computational modeling of scenarios like this, what you see is that the effects of it are not evenly distributed over the Earth's surface. So the CO2 level, well, not the CO2 level, but globally, the temperature, if you average the temperature over the whole Earth, it's going to go down some. But if you look at a map showing how those effects are distributed, you may see certain pockets, certain areas where it goes down a lot. You may see certain areas where it goes up. You may see certain areas that are struck by droughts or flooding, and other kind of regionally distributed phenomena. And so once people run those models and get those simulations up on a map and look at what's going to happen, there may be some countries or some regions of the world that are very, very unhappy about solar geoengineering, which to me as a novelist just looks like fodder for storytelling and development of a plot. And that is essentially what I've done in Termination Shock.
Right. So the geopolitics of geoengineering is really prominent. And in the novel, all of this sulfur dioxide turns out to be good for low-lying areas like Venice or Houston, but terrible for India, where the monsoon begins to fail. And so the Indian government begins to take matters into its own hands. But, actually, as a political scientist, that's I hadn't actually, like Tom Friedman used to talk about super empowered individuals. He was really referring to terrorists. But, what you're raising is the idea that you could actually have an oligarch somewhere that single-handedly could have, do things that would affect essentially the geopolitical distribution of harms and benefits. And the rest of the political world is going to have to adjust to it. I don't think we want to give away the story in the book about how this happens and what the Indian government does, but it's really quite a tale. So one of the things that's always struck me about your writing is that you get into these extremely detailed descriptions of particular parts of society. And in this one, so they're the feral pigs and this guy Rufus that hunts them in, outside of Waco, Texas. That's one. But then you also have Frederica Matilda Louisa Saskia, who is the Queen of the Netherlands. And she's probably the main character in this book. And you've got this incredibly detailed account of the politics of the royal court, that this is not a powerful office, but it has symbolic significance and so forth. So I'm just wondering, how do you do this sort of thing? I mean, actually, in the pre-publication copy that I had, you said you're going to promise to actually lead people to the data that on which these different parts of the book were based. But I wonder if you could just talk about how is it that you actually can write so fluidly and I would say accurately about something like the politics of the Dutch royal court and the House of Orange?
Well, thanks for those kind words. I should say that I realized with horror on Monday, the day before publication, that I had made the claim you just mentioned, that I was going to put up a bibliography. So I did that. It's up on the nealstephenson.com website. It doesn't have much in it about Dutch politics and how that all works. It just depends on the specific kind of character or situation I'm trying to write. So there's no one size fits all sort of method or technique for doing these things. One just has to come at it from different angles. And that's part of the fun of the job, is having to craft different strategies to solve very different asymmetrical kind of problems. In the case of in the case of Dutch politics and all of that, it is. I was actually able to visit the Netherlands shortly prior to COVID. I didn't, when the axe kind of fell in February of 2020, that kind of prevented me from doing a lot of the research travel that I expected to do for this book. But I did get to the Netherlands and also just things like subscribing to say Dutch newspapers or Dutch news feeds, and just keeping an ear to the ground as to what what they're talking about, what seems to be important for them, is also it's a kind of a slow osmotic process of picking up ideas, as opposed to striking pay dirt, and finding a sudden mother lode of information. So it's just a mix of things, and also just looking at the history of the Netherlands, the processes that they use to essentially build a geoengineered country. It was also kind of illuminating.
Yeah. So one of the social groups that you talk about in several of your books is basically red state America. Like in Riemke, it begins with this family that's getting together to shoot off all their AK-47s and their collection of weapons. You've got Rufus in Termination Shock, and a kind of whole gun subculture in that part of Texas. And I'm kind of wondering, you do have roots in that kind of small town America. On the other hand, you live in one of the most liberal cities in the United States, in Seattle. And I wonder how you keep up with that, because it does seem to me that your portrayal of, red America is actually quite sympathetic. I mean, it's, you're not making fun of these people as, total yahoos, but maybe you could talk a little bit about your relationship to that particular social group, because that's obviously one of the sources of our division right now, and the kind of lack of understanding of that part of American society, I think, is something that really hobbles liberals when they, think about, the future of American politics.
Yeah, well, I don't want to overstate my my knowledge or in that area, but I grew up in a college town in Iowa, surrounded by Iowa, which at the time was more of a blue to purple kind of state. It's sort of where the Obama campaign really got its first boost in the primaries, and used to be more purple. And it's one of those states that has become more polarized and generally more red over the last few decades. So I also have family ties in Idaho, and go there frequently to visit a sort of family property that's been in the family since the 1940s. So I generally kind of abhor a lot of what's going on in those parts of the country, and I wouldn't say I'm at all sympathetic to kind of red state politics or the stances that a lot of these people seem to be taking. But it is there. It's out there. It's important. They seem to be finding. I was just reading an article in the New York Times a couple of hours ago about what's going on in Wisconsin right now with efforts to just completely lock down the whole political and election system, and turn it into a one-party Republican state.
It's pretty appalling. Appalling.
It's just shocking, and so part of what a novelist does is try to see things from other people's point of view, even if you don't agree with that person, or agree or sympathize with them at all. In order to write about them convincingly, you've got to be able to see their point of view. So if hypothetically, if I were writing a novel about the Second World War, I might have to put myself, if I were writing a scene with Hitler, I could portray Hitler as just a unidimensional maniac, but it wouldn't be very interesting writing. It's more disturbing and more effective to show people what leads, what is it that leads someone into those kinds of to us crazy and wrong ideations.
Yeah. So there's another little subplot in Termination Shock that I was very curious about. So one of the other important characters is a Sikh, basically bodybuilder who makes a name for himself on the line of actual control between China and India in the Himalayas. And there's a lot of back and forth about the social media attention that's paid and this apparent game that's played where the line is pushed back and forth, not by military force, but by these Chinese and Indians that are basically play acting. So I'd never heard about this. I mean, I'd heard about the line of actual control, but is this for real? I mean, is this something that's actually happening out there in reality?
It's no, it's so what's real, and this is almost, I mean, even the real stuff that's true is almost so bizarre you can't believe it, right? So the line of actual control is a kind of the result of a compromise that was signed between India and China in the early 60s. Basically it was them saying, okay, where the border is, we're going to leave as an open question. But regardless of our disagreements on that, the fact of the matter is that there is this line of actual control, which does not coincide with anyone's opinion about the border, but it is a de facto reality. And so that area is patrolled by both Chinese and Indian military, and there's an agreement in place that there's a ceasefire, and that is, quite literally what it is that no one's going to fire a weapon in that area in anger, and so these military units patrolling this area will occasionally bump into each other, and then they will fight with rocks and sticks and fists and try to move the other guys back. And so this has been going on for 50, 60 years. And there have been occasional flare-ups of more serious violence, but it still happens, every year that there are these skirmishes between Chinese and Indian military up in the highest parts of the Himalayas. We're talking 5,000 meters of altitude, places where normal humans can hardly breathe, in which they fight each other with rocks and sticks, but scrupulously refrain from firing guns. So that is all real, as far as I can tell. The only kind of fictional enhancement that I've created in Termination Shock is I've sort of pushed that a few years into the future, and I've posited the idea that the civilians are getting into the act. And so we've got civilian volunteer groups from both China and India that travel to this remote place and fight each other, still observing the ceasefire. So it's all sort of martial arts. It's sticks, it's fists, it's rocks. And inevitably, it's all being filmed and captured on YouTube, partly just for the entertainment value and partly as a way of keeping everybody honest. So if somebody were to violate the ceasefire, it would be captured and known right away. So it's that volunteer element and the social media phenomenon surrounding it that I've invented in Termination Shock. And yeah, so there's as you mentioned, one of my characters rises to fame and achieves heroic status in India because of his exploits in this area.
Well, it's a great subplot to to a great book. All right, so I want to open this up for other people to ask questions. I just before we quit, I just want to plug a couple other of your books. Recent one, Seven Eves, which is really about the moon falling apart and essentially destroying all life on Earth, but then the human race actually surviving this after another 5,000 years. It's quite a gripping story. The one novel that I thought was really different from everything else you've written was The Rise and Fall of Dodo, which was a kind of comic novel, right from the beginning, because it's all about witches and time travel and things that aren't normally part of the repertoire of a serious science fiction writer. But that's also the only book you've had a co-author for. I wonder if you could say a little bit about, the genesis of that.
Sure. Yeah, DODO is an acronym for the Department of Diachronic Operations, which is a top secret U.S. government black ops team that uses time travel to further the Pentagon's strategic objectives. And the joke is that they've funded a research program that eventually figured out that you could do time travel, but you had to use magic to do it, and the only people who can do magic are witches, and they can only do it inside of a special chamber that kind of filters out. It's like a Faraday cage that filters out the interference of modernity and enables them to do magic again. And so it's sort of it's co-written with Nicole Galland, who's a dear friend and colleague who mostly writes historical novels. And as you say, it's a comedic, it's sort of a romantic comedy kind of storyline about two of the people who meet each other at the beginning of this project. And it's kind of goes back and forth between sort of Kafkaesque bureaucratic farce in the modern era, where you've got witches and Vikings and researchers and linguists who are all trying to coexist within a modern bureaucratic organization with an HR department and all the rest, and action that is set in various historical destinations where these operatives, who are called doers, diachronic operatives, are sent back to carry out various missions. The sort of rules of the game, as it were, are that they can't make big changes. So you can't go back in time and kill Napoleon. It'll have disastrous results. So they tend to get sent back to do what seem like incredibly trivial, make trivial changes that'll have a sort of butterfly effect down through the ages, which I think adds a little bit to the comedic side of what they're doing.
Well, it's a great book. It's a great book.
Thanks. And then Nicole wrote a sequel to it also called Master of Rebels, which came out in February.
Oh, okay. I will definitely have to look for that. I mean, among other things, if you want to know about the Varangian guards of the Byzantine Empire and that whole subculture, you can read about it in this book, because I suspect that nobody else has ever heard of these people. All right, so Suzanne, why don't we open things up for other people to make comments or ask questions?
All right. Now let's see, Michelle says I should start at the left.
Yeah, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raised hand function under reactions at the bottom, and Susie will call on you. Now's your chance.
I have to ask one before I start. How did you decide that it was the Netherlands that you wanted to focus on for your main character?
It was kind of a process of elimination. The effects of global climate change are complicated and strike different places in different ways. And so I wanted to pick an effect that was very obvious and simple. Okay, so sea level rise is about as obvious and simple as you can get. You can argue about the weather, but you can't argue about the fact that your house is full of water. So then so that narrowed it down to countries that are vulnerable to sea level rise, which doesn't narrow it down very much. But I also wanted to focus on countries with a kind of technocratic will to power, as it were. So the countries that have money, that have engineering talent, and that would be willing and able to carry out large engineering projects in order to further their national interests. And so the Netherlands sort of checks all of those boxes. It's not the only country that does, but it just seems so obvious that I couldn't not do it.
And speaking as a pro-Indian, my daughter is married to one. How did you decide on the Indians as, well, they're the villains in this?
The Indians of the country of India, you mean?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't even say that they're villains. They're carrying out the smallest and least damaging possible operation they can think of to protect themselves from what they reasonably perceive as a threat to their national security. So the India is a country that is kind of uniquely in the crosshairs of climate change because of its geographical diversity. There's a number of ways in which it can be damaged by if we do nothing or if we do something. So if we do nothing, we know that there's going to be flooding in the eastern part of the country. In Bengal, we know that there's going to be floods as water comes down out of the Himalayas. And we know that there are going to be these wet bulb events that lead to a lot of fatalities. If we try to geoengineer and mess with the climate and change so to try to intervene to stop the effects of climate change, then we're at risk of tampering with the monsoon cycle, which is how India gets food, basically. So so I think it's reasonable for India to want to have a say in any kind of geoengineering activity, and they've also got the resources, the technology, and the will to take action as needed to protect their national interests.
So this
There's a question in the chat from H.G. Calloway. Maybe you'd like to unmute and ask it out loud.
I can read it if you like.
Okay.
All right, I'll read it, and then we do have someone with their hand up after Susie. But let me read the question from H.G. Calloway. Regarding the theme of centralization, I wonder if you can offer some comment on Minority Report with its themes of surveillance and centralized, corrupt crime prevention. This is surely a masterpiece of P.K. Dick and Spielberg. Are excesses of centralization creating public alienation?
Yeah, great question. It's been a while since I saw the film or read the story, but I did see some news article just recently that people were trying to implement kind of proactive crime prevention in a way that sounded very much like the what happens in the story, for those who don't know it, is that there's kind of a centralized policing system that thinks it can predict in advance who's going to commit a crime. And so tries to preempt crime in a way that's clearly a violation of human rights by any reasonable standard. So it seems as though people are actually trying to implement some of that stuff. It's a big topic, so let me just say that we're in centralization and decentralization sometimes don't manifest as we expect them to in science fiction, right? So what we've got now is like in science fiction, we've predicted surveillance for a long time. From 1984 was written in 1948, and so there's been a lot of predictions along those lines, but it's always been assumed that it would be a Big Brother kind of a scenario where there's a central government that was doing it, because that's what we came to expect from mid-20th century totalitarian states. In fact, we have today a surveillance regime that far exceeds anything that is shown in those kinds of novels, but we've inflicted it upon ourselves by installing surveillance appliances in our own homes. So it never happens the way it's predicted. It always kind of comes out of some funny angle.
Michelle, how about Mr. Epstein?
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion. I wondered if Mr. Stephenson would be willing to talk about his vocation and like how you arrived at the idea of being a novelist. Did you just start writing when you were 5 years old and decide this was what you did? And also, how do you consider your novels at all didactic, or do you just develop whatever story seems to make the best novel? I mean, do you ever think about what's the practical impact of warning people about one thing or another, as opposed to just telling them a story they will find riveting? Over.
Taking those in reverse order, people have pretty good radar for when they're being lectured to. So didactic books, that's something to be avoided, I think, in trying to write a book that you want a lot of people to read. And so the trick is finding ways to convey useful information to people that doesn't come across as lecturing or the departure from good storytelling practice. Let's put it that way. But when people sense that they're reading a book that's got a political axe to grind, the suspension of disbelief goes away pretty fast, and they tend to put the book down at that point. I was interested in being a writer from a young age. I did a bit of writing when I was a teenager. When I was in college, I sat down, I sort of surprised myself by just sitting down and writing a novel. over spring break when I was stuck in a slum apartment with no money and nowhere to go. So I just banged this thing out, which it wasn't very good, but it told me I was capable of writing a novel, which is a thing I hadn't known before. After I got out of college, I wrote a second one, also not published, not very good, and then a third one, which did get published. So up to that point, I was still looking at different possible directions my career might go. I, might go to grad school, what have you. But when I got a book published, I decided I would just continue to pursue that and until it failed, and it hasn't quite failed yet. So I just sort of never looked back.
What's the next one?
I have some ideas for historical novel series that I wrote one of those called the Baroque Cycle some years ago and had a great time doing it. And so I'd kind of like to go back to that well, not the same time period, not the same place. So that's a kind of a vague answer to your question, but that's probably next.
Oh, that's a very good answer for a reader because it suggests that there will be a whole series of them.
I tend to write kind of books that are multiple books lumped together. So the Baroque Cycle was really 8 normal length books kind of clumped into 3 volumes, but they could have been published separately. So that's kind of a habit of mine.
I could ask a further question. Many of your books talk about futures that are pretty catastrophic. So Termination Shock has to do with carbon emissions. 7 Eves, I don't know how plausible the premise is about the moon actually exploding, but it's pretty disastrous. I'm just wondering, as you're obviously a person that keeps up with a lot of the literature about, the future of technology and the way it's going to develop. What is it that worries you the most right now in terms of technological futures that we could be experiencing? I mean, is it related to climate, or are there other things that you think we ought to be, really concerned about that haven't reached the level of consciousness that carbon emissions have at this point?
Well, one that's always lurking out there is smallpox. If that comes back, we're in for a bad time, but it's hard to predict. So there's that.
Why do you choose smallpox? I mean, we're in the middle of COVID. There are all kinds of plagues lurking around the periphery.
Mm-hmm.
But what is it about smallpox that's
just the fatality rate, the death toll, the speed with which it travels? If it were to get loose, it would make COVID seem like a picnic. And nobody's really got an immunity to it anymore. And it's a bad thing. So there's that. The fragmentation of our our inability to agree on shared reality is really alarming, and again, came out of nowhere for me. It makes me want to turn in my credentials as a science fiction writer that I didn't see that coming. Should have seen it coming with the Swift boat thing with John Kerry, which in my experience was the first time someone just did that and kind of weaponized it in a completely shameless and overt way. But I just didn't have the imagination to see that, you know, it was going to become the norm, and that we were going to have a whole political party, so based on that kind of behavior. Those are some of the biggies for sure.
We have 3 minutes left and we have 2 questions in chat. Why don't I just throw them out there and you take the last couple minutes as you like.
Okay.
Okay, so Abram Schultzky has asked, in Cryptonomicon, hope I pronounced that right, you predict the development of a currency somewhat similar to Bitcoin, but you assume that such a currency would require backing in gold. Is this a case where reality is stranger than fiction? First question. And then from someone named Jeff, I'm sorry, I don't have your last name available. How did the Stephen Burry collaboration come about? Was the uncle from Iowa?
So the cryptocurrency startup in Cryptonomicon was sort of based on the state of the art at that time. And one of the things they assumed was that in order to make a stable cryptocurrency, you'd have to have a physical location that was free from government interference. And the use of gold, so that and the use of gold are frankly plot devices. It's just a much more interesting story. If you've got people running around in different jurisdictions trying to set up a secure server room and also trying to recover a lot of gold. None of that is true of blockchain-based cryptocurrencies of today, but it made for a good story 20 years ago. And then the other one was about the collaboration with my uncle, George Jewsbury. He's a historian who grew up in the Midwest and in the Eastern Washington State, and his career as a professor was at Oklahoma State. And we just lived near each other for a while, circa late 1980s, and just decided to try writing a kind of a political thriller or two. So that's how that happened.
Susie or Frank, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, sure. So that was a great discussion, Neal. It was a real pleasure to read the book, to read all of your books, but especially the last one. I hope everybody on the call will take a look at it. It is out just this past week. So thanks very much for spending an hour with us. And, hopefully we can do it again when that next book comes out.
Thanks. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed chatting and catching up with you, Frank, and also hearing some of the questions and dialogue from the other participants.
And stay away from feral hogs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're bad news.
Okay. So long.
Okay, thank
Bravo.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, bye-bye.